to our webinar, 1 week out from Election Day. Get ready for Election Day, amplify your voices and support young voters. I'm Sam Lockhart. I'm joined by the amazing Jasmine Rivera, and who's going to speak to her experience as an actual young voter. um, but I wanted to just start by welcoming everyone and sharing a little bit about why we're here and why National Wildlife Federation is engaged in this work. And also a little bit about where we're going in this session over the next 30 minutes. First off, we're going to talk about why we're here. We're going to talk about young people and first-time voters, some of the unique barriers that exist and how to overcome them and how to support the young people in our lives, whether that's ourselves, our peers, or children, grandchildren, cousins, whoever in your life, in your communities needs that extra support to make sure they're getting to the polls this election cycle. We're going to hear from Jasmine about her experience, firsthand account. We're going to talk a little bit about getting ready for Election Day, what you all need to know going to the polls, and how to ensure that votes are counted over the next few days and how you can support people in your lives in that process as well. I'm going to share a little bit about just protecting election integrity, how to ensure that we're sharing and consuming good information in a really confusing media landscape. Talk a little bit about what to expect after Election Day happens, and that's going to take a little bit of time to count the votes and how we can prepare for that. And then I'll share some volunteer opportunities with everyone. So that is where we are going. Thank you all for joining. Let's kick things off. I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about why National Wildlife Federation is engaged in this work. This is a quote from our founder, Ding Darling: "Wildlife doesn't vote and neither do conservationists." So really one of the motivations behind the founding of the National Wildlife Federation was the goal of ensuring that conservationists and people who care about protecting our natural landscapes and environments and communities were connected to political power, and that they were a relevant voting bloc that then could have influence on the policies in our country. And so it is critical that conservationists actually get out there and vote. That was a recognition early on at our founding. It was part of our mission from the very beginning. And luckily today, conservationists actually voted at a very high level. So congrats on that. I'm going to share some specific words from our CEO, Colin O'Mara, really answering this question of why NWF is engaged in this work. So hopefully you all can hear this.
Hi, I'm Colin O'Mara, and I'm CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. So why is the National Wildlife Federation, a wildlife organization, committed to working on civic engagement and democracy as part of its mission? This work is fundamental to our mission as an organization. Our work for wildlife depends on the participation of conservationists like you across the country, participating in the democratic process, and for that process to be healthy and functioning so that the voices of our movement and voices for wildlife can be heard. From our founding, the National Wildlife Federation has paired strong policies driven by science with a commitment to civic engagement. And at the very first meeting of the National Wildlife Federation more than 80 years ago, the discussion and topic of the day was how do we make sure that people can speak for wildlife because wildlife can't speak for itself. So fair and equitable access to the ballot is critical for wildlife. It's also an environmental justice issue because many of the same communities that experience disproportionate environmental harms are also experiencing the greatest barriers to voting. So as conservationists, we are committed to delivering accurate information to our followers and supporters regardless of the politics. So that includes being a reliable source of information about our democratic process, from sharing opportunities to make comments for rulemakings or encouraging legislators to vote for legislation, to accessing the ballot box and making sure that our every vote counts and all voices are heard.
Stop there. It's a longer video. You're welcome to enjoy all of it. But I wanted to start by just setting the table. Why are we doing this work? And Colin articulates that so well in that clip. So with that, a little bit about specifically young people and first-time voters. First off, the stakes are really high for young folks in the country because voting is about our future, right? As the policies that get set by the people in office, by the ballot initiatives that pass, they have very long-term implications. The policies that get made today have impacts 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future. And whose future really is that? Young people have the biggest stake in what those policies end up being and where we're going as a country and in our environment. What we learned in 2020 was really interesting because the prevailing narrative about young people is that, they're just not interested in voting. They're sort of sitting it out. But in 2020, young people had record turnout. 50% of youth aged 18 to 29 voted. It was an 11-point increase from 2016. And at the same time, there was a huge expansion of the availability of mail-in voting and absentee voting and all of these additional ways that young people could access the ballot. And so I think that tells us a different story, that actually there were barriers in place to voting for young folks, and that when those barriers were reduced or removed, young people did show up to the polls. And so that tells us as people who care about making sure the voices of young people are heard in all of our elections, that we can be doing more to help everyone overcome those barriers and make sure that they get to cast their vote. Unfortunately, since 2020, new laws have added additional hurdles to young voters, making it more difficult to register and to vote either in person or to vote absentee. So there are different it's different in every state, so I can't say blanket. Some places have actually made it a little bit easier, but voter ID laws really vary by place, and that can be really complicated for a lot of young folks. If you're in college, your home address and where you're living might be different places. So even if they're in the same state, your ID might be different. If you want to vote where you're going to school, it can be very complicated to figure out an ID situation that works for you. And then even if you're not at school, young people just tend to be in a more transient phase of their lives. So they often are in places where they don't have the solid address where this is where I'm living and it matches, my ID, and it's very simple. Um, and so that complexity can make something that seems obvious, like having an ID, very, very complicated. Uh, and then absentee and mail-in rules have really changed as well since 2020, state by state, and some in terms of how long in advance you have to request your absentee, when you can get it, all of those things, and limitations in many states on who is even permitted to vote absentee, and what qualifies as making you eligible for absentee voting. So those added complexities can make it more difficult for students to navigate and understand what their opportunities are and within their state to actually cast their vote. And then there's this other barrier, which is that among young non-voters, 42% say that they don't feel qualified enough to vote. So there's this sense that people just don't feel like they know enough. And I think that's another education gap that we can help fill. We know young people do know enough. They can do it. This is their future. So absolutely, we should make sure that folks feel confident and when going to the polls. And youth can overcome those barriers by making a strong plan, understanding what those rules and opportunities are, and actually turning out to vote and getting support from their community and doing all of that, navigating all of that. So just a little bit about young people and why they're a special group when it comes to voting. But I'm really going to hand things over to Jasmine Rivera, who's a recent graduate of Howard University. Go Bisons. I live just a few blocks from Howard. So I'd love to have Jasmine on here. She's a North Carolina voter. And I will let you take it away.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Jasmine. So I graduated from Howard in May of this year, and I'm back in North Carolina now. Loved DC very much. And while I was at Howard, I got to vote for the first time. So I am 21 now, so I believe it was my sophomore year. And that was in the 2022 midterm election. And I guess it wasn't something that I had thought that much of until I had actually done it to realize that I would need an absentee ballot and I would need to figure out how I was going to vote because I wasn't in the state that I was from and that I was going to be voting in. And even though I was pretty well informed on the candidates and everything going into that election, I definitely did not understand that process. I was lucky that North Carolina made it kind of easy to get my absentee ballot, fill it out, and send it back. But obviously, being in college, everyone was from everywhere. And it was so interesting to me to see people being from all different states. And there's no uniform way to vote absentee. And like Sam was saying, there's a lot of different restrictions depending on where you're from. So a lot of people just don't know exactly how to do it. And I know people who just weren't able to vote because they figured it out too late or past the deadline and things like that. So that was definitely a really big learning experience for me because there are some people who just don't want to vote, but there are a lot of people who do want to vote and just have some obstacles in their way that they're not sure how to handle. So I think it's really important for things like this, webinars, and just different organizations to be getting that information out to people so that they at least have an informed way to vote and can make that plan. Because once you have the plan, it's so much easier to do, but it can feel very overwhelming. Especially for young voters, people in our age bracket, a lot of us don't all have cars or we have school or work or different things like that. And so finding the time to vote is huge. I did vote early for this year's election. I think that works a lot better for me. But I know some people can be very stressed out by the long lines and the polls closing and the timeline and everything like that. And I really don't think that voting should have to be a super stressful experience for anyone. So figuring out and people knowing that they have options like I said, early voting and being able to do that. Um, I think that there are definitely challenges in our age group. I was a political science minor, and so a lot of my friends were very like political and they wanted to vote and they were super educated and everything. But there's a lot of people who aren't necessarily in that group who feel like they don't really know that much about politics. So what are they going to do or what should they vote? And like Sam said, like people do know a lot more than they think. And I think that our lived experience as younger people, our lives are shaped by the policies that are happening around us, even if you don't necessarily know every single name or legal title and thing like that. So people are a lot more informed than they think they are, and also just getting out resources to people that will make them feel more educated and more confident. I listen to like a 5-minute podcast that updates me every day on certain things, and sometimes that just makes me feel more up to date on things. And that doesn't mean I'm like a political master or anything, but just giving people whatever it is that works for them to feel like they have the confidence to vote and make that choice. And for our generation, I think it is huge to just remember that these are policies that are affecting us, and that a lot of the time the older generation is voting and the policies might not be affecting them as much. So I think it's only fair and makes sense for us to be voting as well and making our voice and opinions heard. Um, and I know a lot of people do feel like their vote might not matter in our age group. Sometimes we feel like that. I've seen people feel like that with voting in past elections, and maybe it doesn't go the way that they wanted it to. So they feel like, okay, what's the point? But I do think that it's super important in all elections, local and federal elections, that you vote. I think that individual votes are what add up and, make the decision at the end of the day. And a lot of the past presidential and local elections are a lot closer than people realize in terms of percentages of young voters, if they had voted, could be different, So I think it's really important to have a collective power of a lot of people versus just one vote. Obviously, one vote maybe wouldn't do anything, but everybody having that mindset and being able to vote, it does have a collective effect. So yeah, and I think that the only other thing I wanted to say was that for me, voting is super important. I did, when I voted on Sunday, have the first question be obviously the presidential election, but almost everything after that was like 20 different local elections. And that's huge for me being back in North Carolina. Even when I was in DC voting for North Carolina, but being back here, it's super impactful, the local elections that we have when it's people who are controlling the school system or the agriculture or different things like that. Those are things that we feel really direct effects of. And so whatever state that you're from, of course, being able to vote locally and nationally, they all have like a really big effect. And I think that I'm really grateful to have the right to vote and to be able to share my voice. And so I always encourage other people to and to ask questions and learn more about the process, because the more that you know about how to vote and how to make a plan and whatever it is that people might have questions about. I feel like the more confident you are to be able to go in there and, show your voice and make that change. So yeah, that's what I would say about voting so far for me. I've only voted in like 2 elections so far, but it's been great and I plan to vote in more.
A perfect track record is what I'm hearing, 100%. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your perspective. I think it's incredibly valuable, and thank you so much for being a voter. You're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more with everything that you shared, and I'm so glad you're out there speaking out and sharing your voice for your community and for our country.
Of course. Thank you.
Um, okay, I'm going to share to that end about process is so important. Understanding how to do this is really a critical aspect. And so that's what I'm going to turn to next, is just sharing some of the actual how-tos around voting for you or for other people in your lives and communities. Um, so I'm going to just do my technology switcheroo here one more time. Did that work? Hopefully.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, good. All right. So getting ready for election day. We talked a little bit about mail-in ballots. Um, if you've not requested a mail-in ballot, then you should make a plan to vote either early or in person on election day, because in most states, uh, it is too late to request a mail-in ballot. If you are mailing it in, or someone in your life has a mail-in ballot that is still sitting in their home and has not yet been postmarked and mailed, do it today. The USPS has been telling us that because of various delays, they're expecting so many ballots to come in, and particularly in states that have been impacted by hurricanes and natural disasters like North Carolina, they're having even more mail delays. So they're saying you must send it at least a week before. So that's today. So in some states, it can be postmarked by election day as long as it's been received and they can see that it was sent before election day, it'll be counted. In other states, it has to be received by election day. So you can look up that information if in deciding if you can just put it in the mail or if you want to be safe and walk it to a drop box. But if you're nervous, take it to a drop box. You can look up, there's actually this great tool, usvotefoundation.org/election offices, that you can look up all of this great information on who around your Secretary of State and your specific county election supervisors or whoever your election administrator is for your locality, because the rules do vary so much. So if you want to look up, for example, where your drop box is, looking it up through those resources is critically important. There are some external sort of third-party folks that do accumulate this kind of information, but because there are often last-minute changes and things get delayed, it can be really, if you want to be certain that you're getting the accurate information, you should go straight to your election administrators. And that's where this resource is great, because it's helping you identify what the appropriate website is for finding that information out for your locality. The other thing I'll say is if you're mailing something in, really look at those instructions carefully to ensure that your ballot is counted. The rules really vary by state on what's allowed, in terms of sometimes you have to have an ID requirement, even with your mail-in ballots. Signatures are required. Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court there just ruled that if it doesn't have the correct date on it when you sign your ballot, that it won't be counted. And so, these things that seem sort of small, it would be easy to make a clerical error, but are critically important. Secrecy envelopes, not to drag Pennsylvania again, but there was an issue in Pennsylvania also where the secrecy envelopes showed up kind of closed, and people weren't sure if they were allowed to open them in order to put their ballot in it. You can, if you get a fused one, you can open it and you can tape it back down if you need to, as long as your ballot is actually in there inside the secrecy envelope and then put into everything. So again, the instructions vary by state, and so it's just really important to be super careful about reading through those. And then finally, it's really important to track your ballot and make sure it's counted. I actually just got my text message today from Washington, D.C. saying that they got my ballot. But there's a lot of ballot tracking resources that we can share as well that exist out there. So I'm gonna early voting. A lot of states allow early voting, almost all of them, not 100%, but almost all states do have some version of early voting so you can beat the crowds. We already heard that's how Jasmine voted this year. Again, check your Secretary of State, local election officials' website for locations and times. One good thing about voting early is generally early vote locations, you can vote anywhere in your county rather than on election day, you have to vote specifically in your precinct at your polling place. But early voting tends to be any early voting polling location in your county is acceptable. You can walk in. So that's the other benefit of that if you're out and about. And then, of course, election day, you do have to be at your correct precinct. Double check what your precinct is. Sometimes they move between times you voted. Check what the voter ID requirements are when you show up to vote in person. Make sure you understand the poll hours. And definitely bring a friend. And I will say one of the reasons we're so focused on youth around voting is that we invest a lot through, as an organization, through Ranger Rick and our education programs and our magazine in the next generation of conservationists. And those conservationists should also be the next generation of voters and people who have an ethic around civic participation. And so if you have young people in your life, obviously, if they're voting age, you should make sure they vote. But even if they're not, you should bring them with you to the polls. Make sure they see this process and see how they fit into it and really envision it for their future. So it's an opportunity and a teaching moment for young people in your life, and encourage you to take advantage. However you choose to vote, the critical thing is to just make a plan. You should know how you're voting, when you're voting, what day, what time, how you're getting there. This was Jasmine mentioned, a lot of young people don't necessarily have cars. So thinking about how am I getting a ride? Are there, ride share opportunities? Is there someone who can take me? So figuring out all of those pieces. Are you going with someone? Plans should have a who, what, where, and when to them, and make sure you have a solid plan. All right, finally, knowing your rights. And this is again for you or for other people in your life. If the polls close while you're in line, you can stay in line. As long as you're in line by the time polls close, you should be allowed to vote. So it's not like the polls close and they close the doors and they kick everybody out. If you're in line, you get to keep going on in. If you make a mistake on your ballot, you can ask for a new one. Don't be nervous about that, and reassure others in your life if they make a mistake, they can just get a new fresh ballot. If the machines are down at a polling place, you can ask for a paper ballot. And just generally, if you run into any problems on election day, encourage folks to call the Election Protection Hotline, which is 1-866-OUR-VOTE. And that is a great resource. You can actually go and look at their full website, 866ourvote.org, and they have a list of other phone numbers as well for different languages. This is the English speaking number, but they have it available in a variety of languages. And just a few other things I didn't put on the slide, but I wanted to share. If your name is not on the list of registered voters, you're entitled to a provisional ballot. If you have a disability, you are entitled to reasonable accommodations. And if your English is not strong, you can bring someone in with you. And the Voting Rights Act also requires bilingual assistance, varies what that language is based on the county and locality, but you do have rights around translation. All right. So I sped through a lot of that. I did want to also just note that at this time, our environment, our media environment, social media environment is filled with so much mis and disinformation. And so it can be really hard to navigate what is true, what is not true, what's going on. First off, wanted to name disinformation is false or misleading information that's intentionally spread to deceive, confuse, or harm. So there are bad actors involved behind disinformation. Misinformation is when regular people, you and me, make mistakes. They see something online that looks really real, that seems credible, maybe is coming from a source they see as credible, and they spread bad information. And those are two different things. I just want to make sure that we're approaching misinformation with empathy, even as we correct it and question it, and keep our eye on the bad actors that are behind the spread of disinformation, which is different. But how do we stop the spread and do the right thing here? You want to verify your sources, apply skepticism. They can reach anyone. This disinformation and misinformation is getting really good, especially with AI. It is getting almost impossible to discern the difference between deep fake images or videos or sound files and actual verified information. So be empathetic. And when you're assessing information you see online, consider the motives of the messenger that's sharing that information. And before you share anything out, make sure you understand, know what you can about whoever's sharing it, and verify the information through multiple sources that you trust. Trace any claims back to their original source. Finally, I wanted to just reiterate, we know we have really close races up and down the ballot this year. We're not necessarily going to see full results on election day, especially with the increasing use of absentee and mail-in voting, and counting of provisional ballots when it comes to really close elections. And so it's really important to respect election administrators, respect the process, and count all of the votes. Also, wait for multiple major news sources and/or the election administrators to communicate results. There's going to be a lot of noise around who's winning and who's losing and who's up and who's down. Encourage you to just stay calm, turn down the volume on all of that noise, and just focus on what are election administrators saying. If you're seeing multiple major news sources in agreement, then likely that is called, but wait for those things before accepting a result one way or another. And then we also know that ballot counting and curing may be additionally disrupted by recent natural disasters. We know that counting mail-in ballots is, as I mentioned, going to take a little bit of time. Again, I keep picking on Pennsylvania, but I know it's going to be a close one, so it's where these little things can really matter. And the mail-in, the state is not allowed to begin counting the mail-in votes until election day. So just understanding how many folks are voting absentee in that state, how close the election is going to be, the existing infrastructure, we can already say that it is very unlikely that a state like Pennsylvania, we're going to have full results and full count on election day or election night. And we can expect that it's going to take a little bit of time to count. And also curing is after the fact, looking through those provisional ballots, looking through those sort of ballots where there was some question of like, are you at the right precinct, or what's going on? Were you registered? What's going on here? That those issues are resolved and then decided whether they're counted or not. That process may take additional time as well. So just be prepared for this to take a little while. And finally, I know we're a couple minutes over, but I did want to end with a plea to get out there and not only vote, support young voters in your lives, but also volunteer. Two resources. One is election protection. So that's that number I talked about before, 866ourvote.org/volunteer, has a bunch of resources for if you want to be a poll watcher, or someone who is doing election protection at the polls in a completely C3 way. That's where you can go to volunteer and sign up. You can also be a poll worker, powerthepolls.org. It might be a little close to election day to get the necessary training, poll worker training, but it varies again by state, so worth investigating. There is a poll worker shortage going on. So two wonderful nonpartisan ways for folks to participate and volunteer in their communities around this election to ensure a safe and secure election process. So I will end there and say thank you to everyone so much for joining. Thank Thank you especially to Jasmine for being on and sharing her story. And I hope you all have a great rest of your evening.
Thank
So.
you.